Shocking absolutely no one, Zelda 2 comes out at the bottom of my list. This game doesn't even have The Legend of Zelda in the title. You could seriously argue that this isn't a real Zelda game, but when you look at this game, when you take it into full consideration, it's basically Dark Souls before there was Dark Souls, right? There is no focus on exploration, there is no puzzle solving, there's nothing. All you're doing is getting through these labyrinths, fighting enemies, and destroying bosses to return crystals so you can wake up a second Zelda. Yeah, the lore of this game is that this is the same Link as the first Zelda, but the girl herself is different, which makes no sense. The game is in recent years the game has gotten a lot of reevaluation for being legitimately very good for what it is, right? But I don't think there's any denying that this is nowhere near the same caliber of game as the original, and even the creators have come out and said that. I consider Phantom Hourglass to be a relatively weak Zelda game. It's one of the very few that I've never really seriously tried to replay. A lot of weird, gimmicky aspects to it, including a dungeon that you have to return to over and over again, stealth mechanics, touch controls that don't work all that well, low difficulty. The game in general just is not all that appealing. And although I think a lot of people tend to overstate the game's problems and really push the idea that it's a complete disaster, there are some redeeming qualities to it, right? The mechanics that this game offers with the DS's functionalities truly is unique, right? There are some puzzles here that you would never see anywhere else. You know, the sailing in this game is arguably a little bit better than it is in Wind Waker. Like, there are positive aspects to this experience, right? Like, Phantom Hourglass is not a complete disaster in any way, shape, or form, but there is no denying that this is absolutely one of the weakest Zelda games in the entire franchise. Minish Cap is an interesting release because it's the first Zelda game that I ever 100% in. As a result, I have a really deep intrinsic knowledge of the game and its qualities and its flaws. And there's quite a bit to like about this one. I love the town. I love the idea of like becoming small and exploring the world and stuff like that. But the game's length, like the worst world map in Zelda history, like the weird story decisions, like, oh, this is where Link gets his hat, like weird stuff, like having Vaddie as the antagonist and them not doing a whole lot with the concept of Link being Zelda's childhood friend. Like some of the game really feels like it has a lot of the grand original ideas that would become standard in Fujibayashi's era of Zelda that we would see with Skyward Sword, with Breath of the Wild, with Tears of the Kingdom. Like, in a lot of ways, this seems like a bit of a prototype for that. In fact, like, the Minish were even planned to be in Breath of the Wild at one point. But, like, I think as a whole, the game really suffers. The top-down perspective is very vibrant and lively, but like it just kind of looks off. The bosses are uninspired. The game just doesn't feel nearly as good as any other top-down Zelda. This is the weakest Zelda has ever been when it comes to the top-down perspective. In spite of Phantom Hourglass's polarizing reception, Nintendo went ahead and greenlit a sequel. And they actually did address a lot of the problems with Phantom Hourglass. The dungeons are better, the controls are slightly better, the story is way more interesting, and the game just really does quite a lot to make the experience feel a lot more interesting than what Phantom Hourglass did. The concept of like fighting a demon that's imprisoned through enchanted train tracks is like amazing. The idea that you're an engineer going around like just exploring these locations, like restoring the spirit tracks, it's really interesting. I really wish they brought this concept back in a future game, but unfortunately, it's kind of been relegated to this one release. Whatever problems this game has, it's entirely because it's a sequel to Phantom Hourglass. The controls are better, but they're still touchscreen based. The dungeons are better, but like they're still not as good as the standard Zelda dungeons. Boss fights are better. Like, um, as much as I like this game and its personality, especially its portrayal of Zelda, who is the funniest she's ever been in this entry, the game just, in general, doesn't really deliver on the same kind of experience I expect from Zelda. There are a lot of really interesting things about it. One of the most notable being that like Zelda tags along with you the entire game in ghost form, right? Like her body has been kidnapped, but her soul is like with you the entire time. So you get to know her very well and feel like you actually have a bit of a relationship with her. It's the most it's arguably the most compelling the character has ever been. She's so likable in this, and I can't begin to tell you just how interesting, how much of a unique take that is on the character. Uh, it was the beginning of like the current era where Nintendo portrayed Link and Zelda as having some kind of romantic relationship, and I think this game really does have an important place in history for that reason. It really just goes to show you how Nintendo is constantly evolving and trying new things, even when it comes to arguably lackluster titles like this. I am personally very, very fond of Spirit Tracks. Oh boy, the disappointment of my childhood. The game that everyone thought was going to be the best game ever. Oh, it's going to be Zelda, but for adults. I spent like 2 years eagerly anticipating this. I followed along its development in gaming magazines and looked at blogs and dreamed of the day that this game would come out and just blow my socks off. And, yeah, it was somewhat disappointing, not gonna lie. Now, I've played the game several times and I've come to terms with the fact that it's not the best thing ever, but there is no denying that I am very, very attached to Twilight Princess. Right? The visual style has aged surprisingly well, right? Link is the coolest he's ever looked. There are so many interesting mechanics with the dungeons. Walking along on magnetic surfaces in the Goron mines was so cool, right? The story is really good. The characters are the arguably the best they've ever been, especially the supporting cast, right? There are a lot of things I like about Twilight Princess, but it really struggles in certain critical aspects. I think the one that everyone always brings up is the antagonist Zant, who is probably one of the biggest bait and switch antagonists we've ever had in the franchise, right? This is what people mean when they say that Ganondorf has kind of overstayed his welcome, or at least he did back then. This isn't really an issue these days, but like back when this game came out, people were tired of Ganondorf being like the antagonist all the time, and they were really excited to see a new antagonist takes center stage, and he looks interesting, he's cool, he's intimidating, you don't know what his powers are or what he can do or this and that, and then like really infamously the character turns out to be a complete joke, and then Ganondorf hijacks the entire plot. It's so underwhelming. Like the entire last two dungeons of this feel like such a disappointment, and really feels, in general, the game feels like it just didn't come together all that well. And by the time Skyward Sword came out, it felt like Nintendo had a clear direction for the series, but at this point, this was the beginning of the dark age of Zelda. Wind Waker today is mostly talked about because of how the art style was received when it was first shown off. People were expecting something cool and interesting and engaging, something that looked realistic, right? And seeing this cartoony nonsense put a lot of people off. But I always liked the style. I was always excited for it. I was always into the game. I loved the personality. I loved the expressions. I loved how animated it is. And yeah, I do think the presentation is one of the stronger aspects of Wind Waker. They really nailed this really unique aesthetic that, in a lot of ways, hasn't aged a day since it first came out. Like, I still love the way the game looks. I still love the design of the characters and the animations of Link. It's a really cool really cool aesthetic that I wish they would come back to and try again. But like the reality is, um, in a lot of ways, this game is very reliant on its style, right? It's very reliant on being style over substance in this regard because the game isn't all that long. A lot of the dungeons aren't great. The game has a reputation for being too easy. There's the infamous Triforce hunt at the end, which they fixed a little bit in the HD release. There are things to talk about. I do think in a lot of ways this was a title that was made specifically because Nintendo knew that it was going to be difficult to follow up on Ocarina of Time, and that's why they went out of their way to make something so distinct and different. And in a lot of ways, they didn't really succeed. The hipsters' favorite Zelda. Majora's Mask was really controversial when it first came out because of its radical changes from the formula. But I think that's what makes it interesting, right? I have really fond memories of really struggling figuring this game out with the scheduling system and the mechanics and the way things changed from going from Ocarina to this. Like this was a really mind-numbing game to wrap your mind around. But once you do, you have a very engaging, fresh experience that's unlike any other. A lot of people will tell you that this is their favorite Zelda game or their favorite game ever made. And I don't disagree that the game is great. It's fantastic for what it is, but I don't know if it excels as a Zelda game per se. Because when you really think about it, nobody really cares about the dungeons or like the adventure aspect. Like the things that everybody remembers about this game are like the NPCs and like the really robust quest system, right? Which is way more interesting than anything in in Ocarina of Time. Like the world really feels vibrant and alive in this one. Arguably one of the darkest, bleakest settings that Nintendo has ever created. And it is so memorable going through this game and interacting with all these characters. It's just a really engaging experience. However, like the core dungeons, there's only four of them. Most of them aren't that memorable. Most of them aren't that good. The bosses, I would say, are probably in general a little bit better than they were in Ocarina of Time. But like at the end of the day, like this game is more challenging than Ocarina. It has a lot more content than Ocarina. It has a lot more going on than Ocarina. But is it a better game necessarily? I don't necessarily think it is, right? In a lot of ways, this game is too difficult to get into and it's unappealing to a lot of people. But if you get into it, you will discover a fantastic game. Although A Link to the Past is my personal favorite Zelda game, I don't consider it the best. Whenever I think about it, I always think A Link to the Past kind of comes up short compared to a lot of Zelda games because I do think its length, although it's appealing for me personally, is a big issue. Most people blow through this game in a weekend. And although it makes it highly replayable and the game is a lot of fun, there is this sense that the game, despite its legacy and despite how like legendary it is, hasn't necessarily aged all that well because there are just so many other games in this series that take the ideas that A Link to the Past established and did them better, right? Ocarina doubled down on like the characters and the storytelling and making it feel more cinematic. Link's Awakening gave the game a more vibrant, interesting vibe. A Link Between Worlds added a lot more mechanics to the same setting, right? Like it is a Link to the Past is undoubtedly an amazing game and one that I really, really personally consider my favorite. Like that I consider one of my favorites. But when I look at it objectively, is it the best? And I think that in a lot of ways, this is a title that's been overshadowed by everything else that's happened since then, right? Like I do think there are a number of better Zelda games out there, and I personally find myself very tired of people who like will try and tell you this is the last good Zelda game ever made or the last Zelda game they ever played. Like you'll see a lot of people who don't play Nintendo anymore like try and say that, but in a reality, the game was overshadowed a long time ago. I think there are plenty of other games in the franchise that are better than this. But that isn't to say the game isn't bad. The game does have very memorable areas. It has very memorable mechanics. The light and dark world is really really interesting. I love a lot of the boss fights. I love like, how straightforward it all is. Like this game absolutely has a place as like one of the iconic Zelda games out there, but that doesn't necessarily translate to being objectively the best. One of the cringiest things about this list, in my opinion, is that I have to put the Oracle games together because I consider Oracle of Seasons to be way, way better than Oracle of Ages. But because these games are so interchangeably linked, you have to play them both to get the real ending. Like you kind of have to lump them in together, and I think most people do. And I think it's a big reason why these games are so overlooked, the most overlooked Zelda games right now, in my opinion, because of like the way it works, because you have to play through both of them, because they're so different, because like it's kind of difficult to process exactly what's going on here, because like it was a Game Boy Color game released in 2001, right? Like these games were amazing, right? Some of the best dungeon designs I've ever seen in any Zelda game. Some of the most innovative like items and like puzzles and dungeon designs. Like this is an amazing experience, and yet I don't see enough people talk about them. One of the big things I've been pushing for over the past couple of years since the Link's Awakening remake came out was for a proper remake of this. I wanted Grezzo to get on that immediately and have it out within like 4 or 5 years, and it still has not happened yet. Like I was expecting this by now, and we still haven't gotten a remake of this. Really? We're talking about like Twilight Princess and Ocarina of Time remakes, but not the Oracle games, really. Like this is these are games that I really desperately want to reach a new audience because I think a lot of people are really really sleeping on how great these games actually are. It's not that long ago that a lot of people wrote off Skyward Sword as being one of the worst games ever made, right? A lot of people called this game a disaster and said it killed the Zelda IP and that they hated this game, that this was one of the worst ever made. It was typical Pretendo nonsense, okay? At the time, Zelda hate was still going strong and people weren't aware that Nintendo was really starting to hit it out of the park again, right? Spirit Tracks was kind of the beginning of it where they were starting to really innovate and like push the bar in certain areas. But Skyward Sword is where it really, really came into full swing, right? This game felt innovative, it felt fresh, it felt original, it felt like a real adventure, right? For a long time, like I considered it one of my personal favorite Zelda games, right? Like this was such a blast to go through with some of the best dungeon designs we've ever seen in a 3D Zelda game, with interesting new mechanics, with motion controlled swordplay, which I had been looking forward to since the Wii came out. Right, this game was so innovative and so distinct, and in a lot of ways, it did not get the respect it deserved. So many people wrote this game off when it first came out. So many people complained about arbitrary things that didn't really matter. Like the boss designs and like the some aspects of the plot and some things like that. But when you take the game into account, when you really take the game in as a whole, like you're left with one of the best adventures in any game ever, right? This game, every time I return to it, I am shocked at how good it is. It is right now possibly my favorite of the Ocarina style Zelda games. I just positively love this game. I think it's stellar. I think it's really been I think it really is the start of this new era of Zelda that we're experiencing now with the new wave of games, and I hope that eventually this game will get reevaluated and get the credit it deserves. I think this game is very, very overlooked, and more people really, really need to give it the credit that it deserves. It's kind of weird to to come out and talk about The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, right? This is my one of my childhood favorite Zelda games. This is something I played a lot as a kid. Never beat it until I was much older. But looking back on it, this was one of the most magical experiences I ever had. Going through Koholint Island, interacting with Marion and Talon and like waking up the Windfish. It is really like an incredible experience. And I think the game has gotten a lot more attention because of this remake, which really polished up whatever issues the Game Boy originals had, namely the button placements and things like that. Like this game was always phenomenal, but seeing it in HD, seeing more people play it has been like an amazing experience. I'm seeing more and more people consider it their favorite Zelda game, right? I just love the music, the sprite work, like everything about it. The general gameplay of the dungeon design. The bosses are probably the best in any traditional 2D overhead Zelda, right? The mini boss system is great. There's just so much going on here. The homage to Mario stuff, like the game is just never stops being creative and wacky and quirky, and it has this really unique dreamlike tone to it that I you don't see a lot in a lot of Zelda games, and I really consider this one of my favorites. Ocarina of Time kind of transcends itself in a way. Anybody who's played this game knows about its legacy, about the impact it's had on gaming, on what it's contributed to 3D action adventure games. Like how everyone's aware of how popular this game has remained over the years, but it's kind of shocking how many times I've played this, how many times I've returned to it over the years, and still have a fantastic time with it. I love the dungeon designs. I love the way the game plays. I love the boss fights. I love everything about it. Like the game just is the Zelda game that everyone's played, right? It is one of the more well-known games, at least in North America, and in a lot of ways, I it's kind of shocking that this game is 25 years old now and it's still very, very relevant. It's still considered the best game ever made. And I think that that really says a lot about the impact it's left. And in a lot of ways, I don't think it's as good as a lot of others the games on this list, but there's no denying this is still a really amazing entry level 3D game for anybody trying to get into the genre. It is incredible how the original has managed to retain its relevancy over all these years. One of the things that a lot of older fans use as a talking point when talking about Breath of the Wild when it first came out was that like, oh, it's like the original Zelda with the open world and stuff like that. And yeah, that is true. Like the original Zelda is very open-ended. You are free to do whatever you want and go anywhere and just struggle and just try and get through it, right? Try your best. And it is a monumental, incredible thing. It is shocking how much fun it is to go through Zelda and like go through that second quest and fight these bosses and obtain items and like utilize your resources, like figure out what you're supposed to do. Going through Zelda for the first time, it was a very difficult thing for me. It was like way before my time. And the game is really, really difficult. But when I figured it out, I kind of, the more time I spent with the game, the more I realized it really is one of the best gaming experiences ever, right? It is incredibly fun figuring out the game's logic and its world design and its sense of progression, and it has absolutely stood the test of time. It's remarkable that Tears of the Kingdom is not even a year old yet, and yet I already think of it as being one of the best games in the series, right? This is a game that takes about 70 hours to complete, probably more than that if you're going to 100% it. This is a game with incredible incredible mechanics, incredible creativity, improved enemy AI over the original Breath of the Wild, this incredible vast world to explore that's evolved since the previous game. This is a true sequel to Breath of the Wild in a lot of respects. And Nintendo really hit it out of the park with this one. I know a lot of people are in denial about this right now, but Tears of the Kingdom really is something special, right? It really does have some of the best boss fights in any 3D Zelda. You know, dungeons are radically improved over Breath of the Wilds in general, right? Um, the the combat is really fresh and unique with the fusion mechanic, right? There's all this like variety and stuff you could do. The quest system in this game is such a huge improvement over what Breath of the Wild did that I still find myself like finding new things to do and new things to accomplish today. You know, like you'll be building towns, you'll be raiding monster forts, you'll be doing all sorts of stuff. Like there's an incredible amount of stuff to do in this game, and it never stops being fun. All right, like I think the vast majority of people who have played this game haven't even really scratched the surface of the things that are available to do in it. You know, like whenever I come back to it after like taking a bit of a break, I've taken several breaks already. Every time I come back to it, I'm kind of surprised about how much there is still left to do. You know, more shrines to find, more monsters to fight, more quests to uncover. Right, the game just is just bursting with content, and it feels like the vast majority of gamers right now don't really want to admit that the game is as good as it is, right? It reminds me a lot of when Breath of the Wild first came out and people were screeching about like Ubisoft Towers and stuff like that. It was nothing but a cope. It always was, and I do consider this game one of the best Zelda games ever produced. A Link Between Worlds is interesting because it's a direct sequel to A Link to the Past, much like Tears of the Kingdom. And like Tears of the Kingdom, it reuses the map from from A Link to the Past, right? It actually does have the same layout and the same dungeon entrances and stuff like that. I don't know why the dungeons are so different, considering they're supposed to be the same, but whatever. Like when you actually look at A Link Between Worlds, you are greeted with an incredible dose of nostalgia. If you grew up playing A Link to the Past, this is gonna be one of your favorite games ever, right? This game really went out of its way to be a love letter to that original game with like the similar art style and character designs and items while still locations while still giving its own sense of unique identity and personality, right? Instead of the dark world, you're venturing to the alternate reality called low rule, where everybody has an alternate personality and everybody just kind of mean spirited and kind of downtrodden. Like it's probably one of the best truly post-apocalyptic societies we've ever seen in Zelda. Like it's so cool to see all of these locations and how just messed up Lorule is, and learning what happened to it is honestly really really interesting, and seeing what like the antagonist is planning to do about it. Like in a lot of ways, Hilda is one of my favorite Zelda characters ever, like purely because of how she handles this situation, right? Like the game is very very simplistic. It's very much like A Link to the Past and its pacing and how it's structured and stuff like that. There is a lot more text and more cutscenes, but like the game just really is an underrated gem. I don't think enough people talk about this one, probably because it was a top-down title for 3DS in 2013, back when people were still trying to downplay the console. But like this was like a really spectacular game that I was positively over the moon about, and is something that I would really, really like to return to in the near future. Hopefully, I have a chance to play through this game once again. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is the best Zelda game ever made because it innovated on a franchise and series that everyone thought had been dead for years, right? Before this game came out, everyone thought that Zelda was an old IP that was never going to be relevant again, that Ocarina was the peak of the franchise, that Nintendo didn't know what to do, that they didn't know how to make people happy. Like that was a narrative that was very persistent since like Majora's Mask, right? Like that was something that audiences use to justify supporting other inferior developers and consoles. I People push games like Skyrim and Dark Souls, Dark Cloud, Final Fantasy VII, like the narrative for a long time was that all of those games were better than Zelda. And of course, none of that was ever true. But with Breath of the Wild being what it was, being the game that evolved the Zelda formula and really took it to the next level and really, really made a big open world that was worth exploring with fun, interesting mechanics that you couldn't find in any other experience. Looking at what Nintendo did here, it completely destroyed whatever credibility these pretendos had been building up for the past several years, right? The past decades, right? The big thing with Skyrim was that it's open world. Well, Zelda, you can fly around the open world. You can set fires. You can, tackle monsters in creative ways. The combat is better. The enemy AI is better. Like look at all these crazy things you can do with just random things you can find lying around. Look at your crazy powers. Look at all this things this game does, right? This game is the best Zelda game ever made because it's it took what already made Zelda great in every past entry, in Skyward Sword, in A Link Between Worlds, and Ocarina, and really, really took it and made it more mainstream again. They took this game, this franchise that had been downplayed for so long, and brought it roaring back into full force to the point where it wasn't really possible to downplay it the way that it had been downplayed in the recent past, right? The narrative that had been pushed against Zelda for decades was completely torn apart by this one release. And it led the Switch into dominating the console generation. It led the charge when it came to uh, just new Nintendo games in general. And it's honestly, I think, a major turning point for how the general public views this IP and this company. More people need to acknowledge that Breath of the Wild was a spectacular breath of fresh air and should be considered as one of the greatest games ever made.